Today we gather to celebrate the life and legacy of Willie Curtis Cooper, Sr. Born in Littleton, Virginia in 1934, Willie Curtis Cooper was the youngest of 13 children. His father, Roger Cooper, worked in the sawmill, and his mother, Annie Cooper, was a maid. Raised in an abandoned church house, which was the only structure large enough to accommodate the enormous family, Willie always spoke fondly of his siblings, who he says spoiled him. "I came along behind all of my brothers and sisters," he said. "My nieces and nephews felt more like my siblings. So from that perspective, I always lived in the future." When he was about 6 years old, the family moved into the bigger town of Waverly, population 1,300. As luck would have it, he moved near the Good family, and their youngest child, Barbara Good, would one day become his wife. Even though he excelled at his lessons, Willie had many God-given talents. His high school yearbook, for which he was the art editor, reveals that he was captain of both the football and basketball teams and editor of the school newspaper. You may have known Willie well, but did you know that his life ambition as a teenager was to become a commercial artist? At the time of his death, some of his oil paintings still hung in his dining room. In 1953, Willie graduated from Sussex County Training School, which was the segregated high school in Waverly, Virginia. At that time, he traded his love of art for a football scholarship to North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina. His heart was broken when he was cut from the team in his sophomore year. Undaunted, he followed the example of his closest brother, Wilbert Cooper, and enlisted in the United States Air Force. There, he felt that he could not only serve his country, but also continue his education and meet the high expectations he'd set for himself. Well, it started off rocky. According to Willie, quote, "I was assigned to an administrative career. I was very upset. I did not see myself as an office clerk." Well, he stuck it out, and after 2 years decided to re-enlist and make the military his career. With the re-enlistment bonus, he bought a 1954 Buick, Clover Green, with a lime green panel and a silver airplane hood ornament. He named his car Old Betsy, and he pampered her for more than a decade. He remained a Buick man for most of his life. His first assignment as an airman first class was to North Truro Air Force Station in Massachusetts. It was then that he went in search of his childhood sweetheart, Barbara, who was partying her way out of the back door at Virginia State University. They got married on November 27, 1954, in Stamford, Connecticut. During Willie's first assignment overseas, Barbara gave birth to Desiree in Itazuki, Japan in 1960. The couple would return back to Japan 2 other times, once to Misawa, Japan, and finally to Okinawa, Japan, before Willie retired from the Air Force 20 years later. Their son, Willie Jr., or Bill, was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1961. Even while traveling and supporting a young family, Willie never lost sight of his studies. He graduated from NCO Leadership School in 1962 and became a military training instructor for new recruits. It was a challenge, but very rewarding to take young people off the streets and in 6 weeks turn them into men, he wrote of his time as an instructor. By the time they entered the 5th week, the recruits functioned like a machine. 45 men marching down the street, everyone in step, all arms moving together. They made a sound that you could never forget. Willie firmly believed that education was the door to equality. He became a STEM teacher for his children, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, long before it was fashionable. Instead of bedtime stories, he taught them about gravity, buoyancy, and electronics. During the summers, he required the children to read science books and do reports before going outside to play. On Saturdays, he took them to fly radio-controlled airplanes, where they learned about lift and thrust. He emphasized schooling so much that Desiree started 1st grade, able to read and do math at a 3rd grade level. And not only did Willie Jr. excel in his studies, but he also inherited his father's love of making model airplanes. Willie Jr. credits model making and going to the hobby shop with his dad as major influences in his decision to become an architect. Willie continued his college education, graduating from St. Mary's College with an undergraduate degree in history and political science in 1965. Before the age of 45, the man who had attended a tiny segregated school in rural Virginia had also earned his master's degree in guidance and counseling from the University of Maryland, a certification at Old Dominion University in special education, and would eventually complete all but his dissertation for a PhD in urban services from Old Dominion University. He was truly a lifelong learner. When anyone asked Willie Jr. what he wanted to be when he grew up, he'd say, "A study man, like my father." Despite his often intense and serious exterior, Willie was a caring father who loved to take his family on road trips. They took full advantage of military life, engaging with the culture and sights around every base where they were stationed. Willie was fond of pointing out at raging rivers or mountain cascades, suspension bridges, trains, and airplanes and saying, "Boy, that's a dangerous thing." Willie served his country for 20 years in the Air Force. It was a choice that required great sacrifice, as he was often assigned away from the family on temporary duty to places like Germany, the Philippines, Korea, and Taiwan for months at a time. In 1966, he was sent to Thailand for an entire year during the Vietnam War to work on the radar systems of the F-4C Phantom jets. Before he left for Thailand, he installed indoor plumbing in his mother's house in Waverly and built a storage shed in the backyard. Barbara and the children lived there with his mother until he returned home a year later. He talked about how hard it was to be away from the family so often. The family recorded reel-to-reel tapes and mailed them back and forth, along with letters to stay connected. "I lived to receive a letter from home," he said about his time away. "It was hard to be apart for so long, knowing the kids were growing up without me." When the year was up, he was assigned to Misawa, Japan. He arranged to reunite with the family in the airport in Yokohama. "They missed their connection in California, and I had no idea what plane they would arrive on," he said of the days long before cell phones allowed constant communication. "I stayed in the airport for 2 days looking for my family." Willie started smoking a pipe as a young man, adding to his image as an intellectual. Back in the days when smoking was still hip, the kids remember putting their noses into his leather tobacco pouch and breathing in the rich smell. "It was the best smell in the world," said Willie Jr. When his first grandchild, Melvin III, was born in 1987, he put his pipe down after more than 25 years and never smoked again. One of his proudest achievements was co-founding the Cooper family reunion with his closest brother, Wilbert Cooper. The reunion evolved from a 1971 backyard picnic in their hometown of Waverly. Over the years, the reunion evolved into a highly structured weekend family retreat in cities from Detroit to New Orleans to Charlotte. It had committee meetings, awards, scholarships, banquets, sightseeing, and even worship services. Through good times and bad, the two brothers guided the reunion every summer for decades, and no reunion was ever over until one of the brothers cried. The tradition has survived more than 40 years. When the family last met in 2019, descendants of each of the original 13 brothers and sisters were in attendance. They once went to the Obama White House to celebrate the family's achievement and the history of blacks in America. Even the coronavirus did not keep the family apart. In lieu of a traditional reunion, the family met virtually in the summer of 2020. At 86, Willie was in attendance. After traveling with his family to more than a half-dozen bases over 20 years, Willie retired from the Air Force with an honorable discharge in 1974. The family settled in Chesapeake, Virginia, only an hour from where Willie and Barbara were born. In civilian life, Willie reinvented himself again. In 1975, he began a 14-year career at the Southeastern Virginia Training Center, a state residential facility for developmentally disabled adults. In his retirement, he also continued his work for justice and equality. He became a prominent member of the local NAACP, of which he was a lifetime member, and in 1979 became the co-founder and president of Chesapeake Forward. In 2005, he became the treasurer of Chesapeake Men for Progress. He helped integrate the city government and facilitated the election in 1980 of Chesapeake's first and only black mayor, William Bill Ward. Willie appeared before the City Council on numerous occasions, addressing issues ranging from access to city services, police brutality, and discrimination against black public school teachers. He was also deeply involved in church activities. If there's one thing he always believed in, it was the duty to vote. With all of his community and church engagement, he never lost sight of his role as a father. For countless summers, he coached his son, Willie Jr., in baseball. And for his grandchildren, he built this playscape by hand. It's even still standing, where his great-grandchildren are now enjoying it. In 1986, Willie became a small business owner when he took over Quality Sales, a used car lot in Norfolk, Virginia, after his brother-in-law's untimely death. At age 53, Willie, who had gone from an aspiring commercial artist to an electrical engineer, to a diversity officer in the Air Force, to work with the developmentally disabled, transformed himself again. He loved running a small business and being his own boss. Willie ran Quality Sales along with his wife Barbara, and then later leased it for more than 20 years. In 2012, Willie joined Mount Zion Interdenominational Christian Community Church in Norfolk, Virginia. The church became the center of his life as he faithfully attended weekly Bible study, Sunday service, and special events. He served the church at all levels, tithing faithfully, maintaining the church grounds, and even building a storage outbuilding by himself. It was a moment of great pride when he became a deacon of the church in January 2014. Willie is survived by his wife of 66 years and childhood sweetheart, Barbara. By his daughter, Desiree Cooper. By his son, Willie Cooper Jr., and his daughter-in-law, Maria. His grandson, Melvin J. Hollowell III. His granddaughter, Desiree Montgomery, and his son-in-law, Adrian Montgomery. His three great-grandchildren, Jackson Montgomery, Aaliyah Montgomery, and Jordan Montgomery. A host of nieces and nephews. And his beloved Yorkie and sidekick, Paris. What did we learn from Willie's extraordinary life? Pride. His lawn was always the best on the block. He always gave 100% to his work, family, and community. Determination. All it took for him to accomplish something was for someone to tell him that he couldn't do it. Even when he could barely walk, he would get up each morning and make up his bed. Justice. He fought for racial equality his entire life. If he could have, he would have been honored to march alongside a new generation to support Black Lives Matter. Family. He gave his all for his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. Toward the end of his life, his best friend was Little Man, his toddler great-grandson, Jordan Montgomery. His commitment to the Cooper family reunion ensures that his legacy will live on for Jordan and for all of the Cooper descendants. Learning. He believed that education was the key to transformation. Faith. He found much comfort in the church, seeking meaning in the Word of God. Love. He remained committed to his childhood sweetheart Barbara until the day he died. To Willie C. Cooper Sr., our dear husband, father, uncle, grandfather, great-grandfather, and friend, your memory will always be a blessing.